Today, we're diving into something that sounds, on the surface, incredibly dry. A single, obscure lawsuit. But, hidden inside all that legalese is a truly radical blueprint for a complete and total reset of society. So, how do we get from a simple property dispute to a plan for a collapsing world? Let's get into it.
So, it all kicks off in Seattle. The year is 2026, and a lawsuit is filed to quiet a title. Now, for anyone who doesn't live and breathe legal documents, this is a pretty standard procedure. It's used to make sure you have clear ownership of a piece of property, to get rid of old claims or sort out where the fence line is. Pretty boring stuff, right? Well, here's the twist. What if this was never really about a small plot of land? What if the real goal here was to find a kind of legal escape hatch from a world that the people filing this lawsuit believe is completely falling apart around them?
To understand that absolutely giant leap, we've got to look a little closer at the specifics of this very, very curious case in Seattle.
Okay, so the lawsuit is all about something called the Seattle-Bremerton Majorat. The documents claim this thing is a hereditary estate and that it has its own permanent rules. And get this, one of those rules supposedly bans any outside law enforcement from setting foot on the property. It's a direct challenge to what the lawsuit calls quasi-governmental encroachment, which is basically a fancy way of saying the government is overstepping its bounds.
So what on earth is a majorat? Honestly, it's an old, almost medieval idea. I want you to think of a grand estate from an old movie, something that's passed down to a single heir, designed to be kept whole, forever. The property rights, even the way it's governed, are all hereditary. They can't be sold off. It's a completely different way of thinking about ownership and who's in charge.
And this chart right here really shows you just how radical this claim is. On one hand, you have traditional property law. Authority, that belongs to the state and county. Rules, those are public zoning codes. Enforcement, that's the city police and the courts. But the majorat's claim flips all of that on its head. They're claiming sovereign, private authority, their own hereditary rules, and that police are prohibited. This is not a property dispute. It's a declaration of independence for a tiny piece of land.
So you have to ask, why file a lawsuit this extreme, and why now? Well, according to the documents, it isn't really a choice. It's a desperate response to a system they see as being in a total freefall, a phenomenon they call the Great Unraveling.
The analysis behind this lawsuit paints a really grim picture of institutional failure. It argues that, quote, the state fails to protect data or health. And it's not just talking in abstracts. It points to real-world events like massive data breaches that affected over 1 million people as proof that the basic promises society makes to its citizens are being broken. And it doesn't stop with data breaches. The legal system itself is in the crosshairs. The documents argue that the courts fail to provide procedural clarity, pointing out how easily cases can get thrown out on minor technicalities. The whole argument is that the fundamental machinery of the state is just grinding to a halt.
So all of these separate problems, the failing security, the confusing courts, they're all tied together under this one name, the Great Unraveling. It's not just a few isolated issues, it's being presented as a deep, systemic decay of the very institutions that are supposed to hold our world together.
Okay, but this is where the story takes a really fascinating turn. The source material argues this isn't random chaos, not at all. It's part of a predictable, repeating pattern that's baked right into the fabric of history itself. Which brings us to a huge question, one that people have debated forever. Do you think history is a straight line, always moving forward, or does it move in big, repeating cycles of growth, decay, and then eventually rebirth?
See, the documents ground their entire worldview in a theory called the fourth turning. The idea is that history moves in these long, roughly 80-year cycles. Each cycle has 4 parts or turnings, and that fourth one, well, that's the big one. It's a period of massive crisis where the entire old order is torn down so a new one can be built from the rubble. So let's just walk through this cycle real quick. It kicks off with a high. Think of the post-World War II boom, a time of strong institutions and communities. That's followed by an awakening, a period of social and spiritual upheaval, like the 1960s. That, in turn, leads to an unraveling, an era of intense individualism, where institutions start to decay. And according to this theory, that brings us to where we are right now, the crisis. The moment the old system finally gives way.
And to back this up, the analysis draws a really interesting parallel between our current unraveling and the Gilded Age of the late 1800s. Back then, you had crises from rapid urbanization and corrupt machine politics. Today, the documents argue, we have health and data crises and widespread institutional incompetence. The claim is that the patterns are basically the same, just with a modern coat of paint.
Okay, so if we're really in a crisis, what's the way out? Well, these documents don't just diagnose the problem, they propose a solution, and wow, it is breathtakingly ambitious. They call it the sovereign recalibration.
It starts with a number so big it almost looks fake. $100 trillion. This is what they call the reparative settlement, and it's designed to wipe clean all the debts and failures of the entire old system. According to the source, this isn't a bailout. This is a total financial reset meant to bankrupt the old order so that something new can be built.
So who would manage this colossal reset? A new entity called Fiducia Centrale. It's described as a kind of sovereign trust, the engine that would power the new system. Now, the absolutely crucial part here is that it would operate completely outside of those old, failing government structures we were talking about earlier.
This new world would be built on three main pillars. First, a sovereign identity framework, where you, not the state, truly own your identity. Second, a policy of truth, which demands total transparency from everyone if they want to participate. And third, something called meta/self-edification, a system for rapid learning and self-improvement to build this new society from the ground up.
So what would it actually feel like to live in this new reality? This whole plan involves completely rewriting the social contract as we know it.
And this is where things get really futuristic, almost like something out of science fiction. A core concept is the Z-axis. In this new framework, your personal source code, things like your birth date and even your DNA, would become the unshakable anchor for your sovereign identity. Think about that. This would completely replace things like social security numbers or driver's licenses.
You know, if you want to boil this entire massive philosophy down to a single idea, this quote from the analysis just nails it. The turn is the transition from a person being a subject of the state's failures to an architect of their own legal reality. It's a vision of ultimate personal freedom and power.
So let's be absolutely clear about this. Based on everything in the source material, this is not a plan for reform. It's not about fixing the current system. The entire stated goal is to build a parallel system that is so different and supposedly so much more effective that it makes the old one completely obsolete. And all of this leaves us with one final, massive question that really sits at the heart of this whole thing. If the old rules, the ones that have governed society for centuries, suddenly no longer apply, who gets to write the new ones?